welcome everyone to our newest conversation of Let's Talk About Hanford. On March 8th, we celebrated International Women's Day. This day honors the achievements of women and the ongoing fight for gender equality. To help us celebrate women and to explain their role during the Cold War in the Hanford Site, we have invited Megan Simpson and Teresa to be our speakers tonight. Together, they have presented on various topics regarding women at Hanford. Regarding Let's Talk About Hanford series, we started these events back in 2020 to cover Hanford-related topics at a high level, and we will continue doing so for as long as there's interest and participation from the public. And on that note, thank you to all the public here tonight with us in joining this event. And now, I would like to present to you my co-host for the night, Sarah Williams.
Thank you, Honor Griselle, and good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Williams, and I am part of the communications team. Regarding tonight's presentation, we do ask you to please put any of your questions or comments that you have into either the Zoom or the Facebook live chat at any time. After our feature presentation, we will have a live question and answer session with you guys. So you can ask your questions through the chat, which will be read by either myself or Anna Griselle. You can also ask your question out loud if you put your name in the chat box or raise your virtual hand. We do encourage questions and comments that are geared towards tonight's topic, which is the Hanford Woman, the Cold War Years. But if you do have any other questions or comments about Hanford or nuclear waste or ecology, please email us at hanford@ecy.wa.gov. Back to you, Anna Griselle.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I guess I didn't remember to introduce myself. My name is Ana Gisela Alvarez, and I work for the Nuclear Waste Program. I'm in the communications unit, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight. And on that note, I am going to introduce you to two wonderful women that we have tonight as our presenters, and they will present themselves. And after that, we will start tonight's presentation. Take it away, Megan and Terry. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having us. So, hi, I'm Megan Simpson, one of the two of the dynamic duo that brings the Hanford Girl and Hanford Woman presentations.
Yes, and I'm Teresa and Megan and I have worked together for some time now, and we are both members of the Bioreactor Museum Association. So we want to make sure to give a shout out to that organization that also works to preserve Hanford history. Shall we get started?
Yeah, I'm ready. Are you?
We can do that. So we can go ahead and start with the first slide. There we go, almost. Right, so this is the Hanford Women. Let's start with that first slide. Go back just one more to the opening slide so that we can define our time frame. Oops, there we go. So the Hanford Woman, the Cold War years is where we're going to be focusing this time. The Cold War years, they're kind of loosely defined, but most scholars will say the Cold War was between 1947 and 1991. Many times when Megan and I have given this presentation, people will come up to us afterwards and say, well, why aren't we hearing about people beyond 1991? And that's because that may someday be a third presentation. But at this point, we're sticking in the Cold War years. And as I mentioned, we're part of the Bioreactor Museum Association. Now, we're going to look at a number of different women during the different time frames. And unfortunately, our time's going to be kind of short today. And there are so many stories that we could tell. It was really difficult for Megan and I to pick out which particular stories to keep into the presentation. So we wouldn't keep you here for hours on end. But at the very end of the presentation, the last screen is going to give you some resources that you can look up and you can listen to even more women's stories or read about them. But we want to start by kind of laying some groundwork. We are going to be back in the 40s to the 90s times were different then. We may be using some phrases that are not phrases that we would use anymore. I like to start each of our presentations with a quote from Michelle Gerber. Now, some of you may recognize Michelle's name. Michelle Gerber was the Hanford historian, and she also wrote a book called On the Home Front. And so Michelle, though, focuses a lot on the World War II, but we can take the World War II concepts and these kind of basic ideas, and we can apply them to other time frames. So this is what Michelle had to say. These historic facts are not mentioned to criticize the past, because it is never wise to apply the standards of one era to another. The Hanford Engineer Works was a 1940s organization, and it functioned by the standards of the 1940s. Just as we cannot criticize the use of asbestos in constructing Hanford, although we might wish that they hadn't used quite so much of it, we cannot criticize the employment realities or the social practices of those days. If we could simply understand the past, then maybe we can learn from it. Sorry. So we're going to apply these principles to the Cold War era over many different decades. So let's go ahead now and go to those 1940s. So the next slide will be in the 1940s. So the war has ended. When I say the war, I'm referring to World War II. So World War II has ended, and DuPont has decided that they did not want to be the contractor any longer. It was understood right from the beginning that once we won the war, DuPont was going to exit. So a new company came in, and that was General Electric. So they came in as the main contractor. Now, think about what was happening at this time. The men are coming back from war. Men are coming back all over the country, and they are reclaiming the jobs that they left behind. So you're Rosie the Riveter and the women who drove ambulances. Many of these women end up going out of the workforce. Although, once we got started working, and actually that started with World War I, and it just ramped up with World War II. It's kind of hard to get everybody to go back home. But at Hanford, once we get into the Cold War eras, women are encouraged to remain employed because the Cold War is heating up and we need these support services. So 1946, there's a major transition. The Army has left, and now we have the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, a new civilian agency. So we've got new people on top. We've got civilians running the show rather than the Army. And that kind of leads me to a little rabbit trail that I'm just going to put out there. I'm not going to actually follow down it. But if the Army had stayed in control, would that have changed how women were viewed and what positions ended up being open to them? It's just something to think about. So we're going to the 1940s. We're at Hanford, and many of the positions have the same tasks that they had during World War II. So Verda Blair, she was an addressograph operator. So what she did is she worked on a machine that put addresses on paperwork, things like invoices and payroll envelopes. And the machine made this a very smooth process that many, many, many pieces of paper could be run through at the same time. But it was a full-time job just to address all those pay envelopes for people out at Hanford. These particular machines were used right up through the 1960s, although once in a while you would hear about people using them even farther than that. But the use of those declined once we started getting photocopy machines, duplicating machines, and early computers. But once we're starting to get into the Cold War, Hanford is ramping up. So it's going to need a lot more support staff. And the increase would also included secretarial staff. So this top photo that you see that says women's training programs, we still have house mothers during this time frame. So most of the women lived in dorms. They had a house mother. This is a house mother training a group of women in the way GE does business, how you do your letterheads, how you format your letters, all the kind of secretarial staff basics that you would know for working with GE. The photo right below them, though, talks about the chemistry class going co-ed. One of the things that GE did is it opened up a lot of educational opportunities so both men and women could get additional education and be able to move into different positions. Now, for women, that meant mostly you might move from the secretarial pool into a lab type position, whereas the men, you might go into a lot more complicated jobs. For example, in that same newspaper, they had a picture of the physics class, and the physics class was all male. So we do need a lot more people in the laboratories, a lot more women who are taking the chemistry are ending up working in the labs because they recruited some laboratory technicians. Now, they did recruit women for laboratory work in World War II, but we see a big increase at this point in time. This picture here, Feminine Dreams to Be, is from 1947. These pictures all came from the internal newspaper. So the newspaper article said that you can be feminine and be a lab worker too. Of course, Feminine Dreams to Be. It goes on to say the long cherished dream of the woman in the technical department is about to be realized. A new laboratory uniform has been designed for her comfort and appearance. Now, Bernice is modeling the old uniform, while Dorothy is modeling the new uniform. And the article goes on to talk about the tailoring being more acceptable and more fashionable for women. So down below that, we have Shirley, and she is pipetting some acid samples, and she's probably wearing the new uniform. And next to her, we have another Bernice. So this is Bernice Williams. And note the title for Bernice. She's a draftsman. We don't have gender neutral titles, and there wasn't a draftswoman title. The article for this one had a caption on it, and it read, "It's not doodling, it's drafting." Like, okay. Women like these paved the way for more advancements, greater knowledge and an expansion of roles into the 1950s. So let's move on to the next slide for the 1950s, please. Okay, 1950s, big expansion out at the Hanford site and an expansion of the roles. Now, sometimes when we think about the 1950s, there are certain images that come to mind. And one of those images is the TV shows, Father Knows Best. And in your magazines, you have the very well turned out domestic engineer, the lady who does her housework in a dress and pearls. And, that really wasn't reality at all. Well, maybe for a very select few, but we are seeing things change on the employment level. On a national level, President Eisenhower sets kind of the stage where he appoints women even to some cabinet positions. It's a time of contrast. There's a lot more opportunities, but we are still bound by a lot of those social norms as well. Now, one example locally would be housing. The women are still living in dorms. They still have house mothers, but some women are able to live in their own houses. A woman, head of household, can rent from General Electric. Margie M. McCormick told the Hanford History Project that she and two other single women rented a 3-bedroom prefab. However, there's a book called Atomic Frontier Days, and from this same time frame, 1956, it talks about a woman who was renting a prefab. Then she got married. You'd think that would be wonderful, but that was actually a problem for her because her husband didn't work for the project. He didn't work for GE. She did. Once she got married, she lost her head of household status, and that meant they lost their housing because he didn't work for the project. Well, they pushed back on this. They contacted their senator. The senator appealed to the Atomic Energy Commission. Atomic Energy Commission is basically your landlord. The government owned all of the housing in Richland, and they refused to budge. So GE had to evict that couple because she was no longer the head of household. If we look down below to Sally Slate, you can see that she was a chemist. She began working in Purex in 1955, and she later worked in redox. And her problem is that she became pregnant. Yeah, once you became pregnant, that was pretty much the start of the end of your career. She told the Hanford History Project, I worked there until I was married and expecting a child. And then they required me to quit. It was the policy to require women to quit during their 5th month of pregnancy. Okay, so on a more positive note, some of these newspaper articles are praising women and talking about what a great job they're doing and how we really can't do this without you. And these 3 pictures in a row are all from one article or one newspaper that came out for Secretariat Week in 1957. And can you imagine this if you saw this today? The top women, the byline on the bottom says sugar and spice. And in the article, it reiterates that sugar and spice, that's what girls are made of. And we're so happy to have them. Then the middle one, where it says gals, those gals are getting corsages to honor them as Girl Fridays. And of course, down at the bottom, they're lauding the lassies, which is very appropriate because we just had St. Patrick's Day. We can laud the lassies. But once in a while, the articles will talk about the person's education. But first off, I'm going to go with the top one next to that was Sharon Stillman. Now, during World War II, you were told that beauty was your badge of courage, and that as a Hanford girl, you would get a manual that part of the manual tells you how you're supposed to dress and how you're supposed to look, that you should have a lipstick and a hairstyle that will last you at least half a day. Well, looking at this, I'd say that that attitude pulled forth into the 1950s as well. This is another Secretarial Week article, and it said that Sharon, and this is a quote, demonstrates that all HAPO secretaries take pride in their personal appearances. The bosses agree that a neat-looking secretary usually means an efficient secretary. And the photo is her, of course, adjusting her makeup. She probably already did her hair. But Vicky, she's working as a secretary. You can see she's doing some filing. But the newspaper article here did give a little bit more of her background. And this newspaper article let us know that she majored in education and that she had many credits towards her master's degree from Boston University. Now, the 50s, we're seeing an increase in new technologies, and we have 4 lovely ladies that are working with IBM equipment. So they are IBM operators. They're working in records control. Now I want to get back to the laboratory for a little bit. These 2 ladies, Esther Howard and Ethel K. Doynton, they are laboratorians. I don't think I've heard that word before. Laboratorians. I'm not sure if that's still in use, but underneath their pictures and the caption said that these are 2 girls who work in the analytical lab. Esther is measuring the moisture of the fuel oil for the K reactors, and Ethel is measuring the purity of the water going to the reactors. One thing I want to note here while I'm talking about these ladies is that sometimes with our current perspective, we might kind of roll our eyes at things like the sugar and spice and the gals and lauding the lassies. But I want to mention that all of the women that were interviewed, and these come from different articles, and some were interviewed with Hanford History Project, their sense of pride in what they were doing and knowing that they were in a very important part of the process came through. Pride was there, but also there was a great deal of patriotism. So I'm going down to Marilyn Devine there in the corner. She reflected back on the early 1950s, and she talked about her feelings about her job. And she said the rewarding part, especially when I was a chemical analyst, was knowing that it was so important for our safety. And she was talking national safety here, that We're in the Cold War. But she also said, it was such a good job. I really loved it. It was important. And that's something, a theme that we're going to hear over and over again of these women understanding that their part in what was going on at Hanford was important. Now, she didn't talk a whole lot about the specifics of her job. Most of the women who worked throughout the Cold War did not do that. The World War II and the Cold War women, they took a vow of secrecy and they meant it. But one of the things that she did say that she did was that she was analyzing sheep's urine. You know, if you can keep your attitude that what you're doing is important while you're analyzing sheep's urine, I think you're doing a really good job. Let's move on to the 1960s. Next slide, please. Okay, I love the 60s. The 60s were turbulent. They were exciting. Things were going on in the world. You know, not so good things in some places, but things were going on in our country, and things were going on here at Hanford. Tensions are rising between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that means that production at Hanford is going to ramp up. We have many more missions, so we need many more people, and we have many more agencies. And you can see under the names of some of these ladies, I put the agencies that they work for. And although there was and there will still remain obstacles for women to move up, we do see a dramatic increase in women that have increasingly higher and more technical positions. Hiring and promotions are being impacted by things that are going on nationwide. And what's happening in the 60s, of course, is there's new civil rights laws. There's laws on the equity of wages. There's a prohibition of discrimination. There's a removal of some labor restrictions. And there's also affirmative action. So I'm going to start with Liz. Liz Kaufman, she started working in 1968. Now, she was recruited for a brand new program. This program was called TOP, TOPP, and it stood for Training, Orientation, and Placement Program. Now, once again, the verbiage will be some that we probably wouldn't use today, but the newspaper article that announced this brand new program said the program was aimed to recruit women and minorities to, and I'll quote, develop them as reliable and effective employees. We might consider that a little condescending today. However, when Liz was hired, she took the mission to heart. She went through all of the training. She completed the training to become a chemical analyst. She worked in the 222S lab. And then throughout the course of her career, she took advantage of every training that was offered for her. She worked really hard and she had a steady series of promotions. By the end of her career, Liz was a level 3 manager. It wasn't always easy. The stories that she told us had implications for her for both being a woman and being a woman of color. It impacted where she worked. It impacted where she lived. Her story is pretty amazing. You can see some of her story on the Hanford History Project. Up next to the 1960s there is Glenna Shirk. And look at that picture. That picture is 1960s. It's pop art. Her head is popping out. She's a chemical analyst, and those circles, there's thousands of circles around her. They represent the sample discs in the Purex analytical lab. I know it's kind of hard to take her seriously with her head floating like that, but I assume she was very good at her job since she was written up in the newspaper. Now, next to her was another woman who was very good at her job, Carolyn Renault. She was a purchaser in the procurement office, but to get there, she started out as an administrative clerk in 1960. By 1964, she became one of the first women to work as a buyer in procurement. Until the 1980s, she worked straight through in that same office. And when she retired in the early 1980s, and she talked about that with Megan and I. And she said, what happened was the group I was working in, one of the buyers took a leave of absence. So I started doing their job when they were gone. And then I just got promoted into it. I loved my job. And if I hadn't left, I'd still be doing it. Time and time again, we see that pattern of people starting, getting more training, learning on the job, and moving up. Now, down below, we have a lady engineer at ARCO. The article starts out with hazel-eyed Sue Adams was ARCO's first lady engineer. So in 1968, the best way to say that we have a new employee is to tell you what their eye color is.
For tomorrow.
All right, going on.
So stop.
We're going to go over to these three women in a row. We've got Deborah Wiggins, Gail Roberts, and Louise Dresden. And here you can see we've got the names of the companies that they worked for, because again, we're diversifying, we're getting a bunch of different companies. There were a number of other women in that particular article, but again, to keep us from being here all night, I just selected these three. They were taking part in a competition, and the competition was the Young Career Woman competition. They had to be nominated by their boss, and then their portfolio was put forth, and they were interviewed for the Young Career Woman. And there's a set judging criteria. Now, this competition is going to be in 1967. So, to be a young career woman, you need to have been working for at least a year in a professional position. You needed to have outstanding scholastic work. You needed to provide some community service or church service. So you could do that. And each girl is going to be judged on her poise and personality. The winner of the regional would go on to a national competition for the nationwide Young Career Woman. Speaking of the young career women, look down below at Margie DeGoyer. Now, Marge worked in the mass spectrometer office as a technician, but she started out originally during the war. She was brought in during the war to be a secretary, but it was noticed that she had an aptitude for math. So she was recruited to be a lab technician starting with World War II. And when she was recruited, she was asked a question. So imagine you're in your interview and you're learning about this job, deciding whether or not you want it. They're interviewing you, deciding if you're a good fit. And your interviewer looks at you and asks, would you prefer to cook or sew? Well, Marge said she really didn't like either one, but if she had to pick one, she guessed she'd rather cook. So that's what landed her in the laboratory. Now, Marge, like many of these other women, she rose to the top. Her skills and ability to solve problems became in demand, so much so that her coworkers and even her supervisor gave her a nickname, and her nickname was the Marie Curie of the lab. So she ended up moving up the ladder, and she eventually ends up running the mass spectrometer at the tea plant. And her boss, in an article in the newspaper, gave her the highest praise. He said that if you have a problem, you bring it to Margie, because Margie can solve any problem with a bobby pin. Okay, so this is just, again, a sampler of the many women working at Hanford at the time, and the majority of the women at this time are still going to be in support roles. And there's continuing to be social issues that are pervasive in both the nation and at the site. And one of the things that caused quite a bit of consternation was, what are women supposed to wear to work, including the popularity of the miniskirt? But that's another story. And now we're going to go to the 1970s, and Megan is going to take over and bring us up to speed from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s.
Okay. So by the time that the 1970s came about, the statistics of women in the workforce remained on an upward trajectory, with more career women working at Hanford than ever before. In 1972, 31% of AEC employees were women, but due to the lack of women in those fields, there were very few women represented in the sciences and engineering, with the AEC Federal Women's Program Coordinator stating the agency's primary concern is to educate our people to use fully the skills and abilities of all women within the agency. We definitely feel there is hidden talent that needs to be developed. Only 2% of workers in crafts, so I'm talking electricians, pipe fitters, steel workers, basically everything that you would need to basically be in a trade to build something. Nationally, were women, so 2%. The rest, men. And the ladies that we interviewed that were in the crafts, well, they told us about developing a thick skin and being able to give as good as you got when it came to cussing and workplace pranks on the job. Now, this was one of just several themes that came up in the interviews that Terry and I had with some incredible women that worked at Hanford during the Cold War. Other themes included the educational opportunities. Several women started at Hanford right out of high school and advanced through several various positions with the encouragement of their management to continue with specific training and classes. They also had to work to be recognized and heard as professional and not discounted due to their gender, with one woman telling us that women had to work twice as hard for twice as long for half the pay that men did. But they were also thankful for good jobs that also had the benefit of working in a place that was important to the country during times of geopolitical uncertainty and later working to protect the environment. Because in the 1970s, we start to see a shift between production to environmental stewardship at Hanford. Now, women in the 1970s held a variety of positions, from being clerks and flexowriter operators right out of high school to some of the first female reactor operators to be certified in the nation who trained and worked at N-Reactor. So we have a couple of them over here. We have Martha Coop over here on the bottom left. And then next to her, we have Nancy Forsman. And then after Nancy, we have Leslie Jensen. Now, Leslie Jensen was a teacher in Richland before she became a reactor operator. And then next to her, above the 1970s, we have Suzanne Lindberg. Now, Suzanne was part of that group of the first female reactor operators to be certified in the nation who worked at N-Reactor. But later on in her career, she became the first supervisor for the control room to be certified in the nation as a woman, which is absolutely incredible. Now, women were able to advance at Hanford through taking advantage of college tuition reimbursement programs, but their days on the job weren't always so rosy. Male coworkers would often make their jobs harder by ignoring them or hiding from them when they needed information. And some male supervisors may or may not have given promotions based on their appearance or how their legs looked in a miniskirt, according to one of the women we interviewed. Another common theme at Hanford at the time was people didn't talk about Hanford, but they knew what was going on out there. And so this is something that we see as far as, well, we don't talk about Hanford from World War II on into the Cold War. But at this point, the jig is up. They know what we're making. And it's still just, we don't talk about it just because of that culture of secrecy. According to Elaine Davis, who is up here on the top left, she came out to Hanford in the 1970s and she was a document clerk. And so what stood out to her the most, and this is from her interview with Terry and I, was that, this is from Elaine, that I was helping to win the war. You know, everybody said, all of my friends that have jobs out there, they said, aren't you scared something's going to blow up? And I said, there's safety all over the place. I don't think I need to worry. that was my opinion. So Elaine was just one of the several hundreds of thousands of women that worked at Hanford during the Cold War. Then we also have some people that were in that higher field. So like Dr. Elena Ikayan, who was a nuclear medicine specialist out at Hanford. And then Anonymous, our cost control analyst. She actually wanted to get into carpentry, but that was a man's field. So very much a boys' club. So she went into the accounting side of things. Now let's move on to the 1980s. And then we still have some more women of distinction from the 1970s before we hop into the 1980s. So we have Phyllis Remblow from Kraft. So she worked in the standards office. And then Shirley Baird was a longtime Hanford employee who, after a considerable amount of time at Hanford, became in management. And then we have some women that were in the Hanford Patrol. Now, they were patrolmen, they were not patrol women. And then we have women in management. And then Wanda Munn was one of the first cognizant engineers out at Hanford starting in the 1970s. And she started a little bit later on in life, in her 30s, as an engineer, going to school when she could while raising her children. And she was there during the 1980s. So let's visit the 1980s. All right, so 1980s. With the Reagan administration in the 1980s, women remained a vital part of Hanford's final production years and more of that shift towards environmental stewardship. Women were able to accomplish some firsts at Hanford back then. So again, Suzanne Lindbergh becoming the first control room supervisor certified in the nation as a woman. Beth Conrad, over here down in the middle, circled. She was the first process control engineer to be certified at Purex and the first radiation monitoring supervisor was Donna Bancroft. And so in the 40 years that Hanford had been around and there being radiation monitoring, she was the first female supervisor in history at Hanford. While more opportunities for advancement and shifts in occupations were available, things at Hanford were changing. According to Diane Least, who got her start at Hanford as a chemical analyst in the 1980s, told us, one thing that was different going from the 80s into the 1990s was how women treated other women at Hanford and how you were viewed. There was more animosity between some of the women because they didn't like to be referred to as just a clerk or just a secretary. But one thing that hadn't changed, being asked if she preferred to sew or cook, just like Marge DeGoyer had when Marge DeGoyer got her start out at Hanford in 1943. So can you imagine 1980s being asked at a job interview whether you liked to sew or cook? I couldn't. And another aspect of work at Hanford that changed according to Lori Mitchell, who began at Hanford as a clerk in the 1970s and worked her way up to shift support supervisor and chemicals purchaser at Purex, was that you could remain at work on a modified assignment while pregnant. Well, 30 years before, as Terry mentioned, you had to quit by the time you were 5 months pregnant. As the shift towards environmental stewardship occurred, women found their way into the tougher jobs at Hanford due to the quota system. Christine Thompson was one of those women. And this is what she said. Well, I had originally applied for a custodial position when they actually called me to come to work. The gentleman on the phone, I don't recall his name, asked if I would be interested in being a D&D worker, and that stands for decontamination and decommissioning. I recall my sister telling me that was a horrible job and not to accept it. But I asked him why, because I had applied for custodial. I hadn't applied for D&D. And he told me that they needed their quota of women. So, quota system still around. Women were basically placed where they were needed. And then, as far as more women of note in the 1980s, we have Julie Gephardt, who was in communications, and she won an award for her work in communications at Hanford. And then we have Trish Wallace. Now, she held a variety of jobs at Hanford over the years, starting actually like in clerical and then moving into being a carpenter, and then coming back out to Hanford, working in instrumentation as a technician. And she was one of the women that told us about the need to develop a thick skin and to give as good as you got when it came to workplace pranks and cussing, because this was largely a man's club and women just had to roll with it. And then we have Lynn Creeder, was, as you notice her title, patrolman. And in the article regarding her, there was also word about one of the canines who was also a girl. And then we still see Wanda as a fixture in the 1980s. Now, let's move on to the 1990s. With the fall of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 1990s ushered in the official completion of Hanford's production mission and the official beginning of the cleanup mission. Women remained just as vital to it, holding diverse positions while still juggling motherhood and responsibilities outside of work. Most of the women we interviewed remained on well into the new millennium, a few of them becoming managers and even a presidential advisory board member. I think Wanda Munn said what it was like being a woman in the workforce during the Cold War the best. But as those of us who came into this profession during this period of time learned very quickly, the people in power were all masculine, as one would expect, but they had no experience in how to deal with a female colleague. Females, yes, they had females around them and a basic part of their lives forever. But dealing with a woman on a level playing field in a technical way was not an experience that they even knew anyone who could relate to them. So the first thing they thought was, one, you're only there because you got a leg up. You're being given a free ride because you happen to be a female. And the other thing they thought is, and if the free ride gives you as much power as we're afraid it's going to, you're going to take my job. So as we went in, we had to do two things. One, we had to prove we were really engineers. We really could do the work. And two, we had to prove to them that we were colleagues of theirs, not interlopers, who we all know the general story about how women got ahead in that time. We had to prove that it wasn't on the slate and that we were not going to take their jobs. And then we have some statistics for you guys as far as the percentage of managers who were women from 1940 to 2009. We can see that it's been on an upward trajectory up until about 1990, and then it's remained stable since then. Of course, the United States Census hasn't updated this as far as the records that we've been able to tell, but it would be fun to see now that we're in the 2020s how many women are managers as a percentage. And then we've got the site-wide workforce demographics from the Hanford site. There's approximately 9,000 workers at Hanford, and 25% of them are female. And then we've got the percentage of women in STEM jobs from 1970 to 2019. And there's certain ones that have gone up and some that have gone down. But one thing is to be certain, women are here to stay in the workforce. right,
Okay, I think
Wonderful.
well, let's go to
fantastic.
this last slide. And one thing I want to do is thank everybody for watching. And I'd like this slide to remain for a while because these are some of the people that we talked about and a bunch of people that we didn't get a chance to bring in because we did want to keep this to a reasonable time frame. But I also want to challenge you. This is what we need to do now. We need to support each other, but we need to understand the past. And I'm going to challenge everybody to have discussions with the women and their families. Talk to your mother, your grandmother, your aunt's best friend, women who have worked between the 80s, the 90s, and cases like me, the 80s, the 90s. It might be a little tough to find people who worked earlier than that, but find out from them what it was like. Ask the questions that maybe might be a little uncomfortable. How were you perceived in the workplace? That might be just too big a question, though. Did your boss ask you to always make the coffee? Did you have a dress code? Did you have to wear heels and hose? In your personal life, when did you get a credit card? I personally was not allowed to get a credit card in my own name in 1975. I had to have my father sign for it because women couldn't have credit cards in their own name until 1975. So these are the things that we would like you to ask about everyday life and their work life, particularly if they worked out at Hanford, so that we can learn from the past, occasionally roll our eyes, but we can look forward to seeing how things have changed. I will say my experience working on this project, particularly working with Megan, one of the biggest things that I have seen in my working career is I see a confidence in the women that are coming up that was hard fought for. And now it's being passed down, and we get to see this blossoming. And it is so good. I cherished my friendship with Wanda. Wanda was brilliant, and Wanda lifted other women up. I didn't know how brilliant she was until after she passed, and I was able to look more into her life. So that's my challenge for you. Speak to the women that you know, learn their stories. Let's make sure that we don't forget where we came from. And I understand we have a ways to go, but we need to honor the women who have come before us. And we want to thank you very much for coming on this journey with us and open it up for any questions about the process that Megan and I went through or any questions that you might have.
Well, I want to take the time to thank you both so much for joining us today. What a wonderful presentation. I can say for me, I learned a lot. So thanks again. We do have some questions for you. I don't know if you want to take a little break, a little breather. And then I'm gonna start with a question for Terry. It says, you mentioned the US Army passed off management of the Hanford site to General Electric in the 1940s. How do you think the available careers for women would be different if the US Army maintained management?
That's something that I've been rolling around. It's kind of a dual thing. Women took a long time to be able to get into positions of power within the military, but women in the military, as in civilian life, have moved up. During World War II, women were specifically recruited for Hanford to be part of the communications grouping because it was felt that the women who signed up for military duties were more likely to obey orders and more likely to take the war seriously. So I'm not sure if it would have been a plus to have the military stay in control, or if things once GE came in and GE, their expansion saw more of a need for women clerical. I don't know. That's one of those things that I want to think about. It just, it's been rolling around in the back of my head, and I'd love to hear what other people might think. What do you think? especially those who might have experience in the military. Would that have been a plus or not? I'm not sure. You know what? The best thing about researching is at the end of every question is more research is necessary. It never ends.
Absolutely.
It really doesn't.
And as a follow-up to that question, do you think there are any examples where the US Army maintained control of a site that could shed a light on how women's careers were different?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. Are there any examples where the US Army maintained control of a site that could shed a light on how women's careers were different?
I don't have an answer for that. Do you, Megan?
It's definitely going to be one of those things where it's like, oh, more research opportunities. So I'm not entirely sure either.
Yeah, it's an area we're going to have to look into. I'm sorry that.
No, that's totally fine. And I have a reminder before we continue with our questions and answers for our people that are connected with us tonight. You can answer your question if you would like, just unmute yourself and please answer your question or put those in the chat at any time.
Awesome. And then I have a question for Megan, if you're up
Yes.
for it. Were there any support groups that were organized by the women there to work together and maybe gather more respect in the male-dominated culture, or just kind of have some kind of like womanly camaraderie?
Yeah, there absolutely were. So there were more than a couple of professional organizations geared towards women at Hanford during the Cold War years, especially during that's transitioned into the from the 1970s into the 1980s with Terry, was it Rockwell? I think it was Rockwell, and it was a professional organization, and they met up and they were basically talking about like basically business things as far as like being women in business and like typical like female topics like dressing for success and what like colors were like basically for power dressing and very 1980s discussions. And there were professional organizations for the secretaries. One of the secretaries from the 1960s that we interviewed, Linda Montgomery, she unfortunately didn't make the cut for what we lovingly call the Hanford Woman highlight reel, which is this abridged presentation that we did tonight, was actually one of the higher ups in the professional organization for the secretaries. And this is like more of those like professional opportunities for professional networking and camaraderie for people that were very much in that same boat of being a secretary in a rapidly changing world, because we're going from manual typewriters to electric typewriters, and then we're getting those first computers and things are getting digitized, and Elaine was having to lug around boxes that weighed 50 pounds. And Terry and I have met Elaine, and she's petite. She's tiny. And it's just like these heavy boxes. And so, with everything just basically changing in that administrative field, and it was nice for these women to basically not feel so alone in this man's club world out at Hanford with these professional organizations.
Thanks. And then I kind of have a follow-up to that. Is there is there like a kind of evolution to those groups to like what's currently out there for women working at Hanford?
So, a lot of those professional organizations have more or less stayed the same, and some have been added. So specifically, the one that comes to mind that Terry and I have actually done presentations for in the past is the Women in Engineering group out at Hanford. And so these are the women that are in those STEM fields. They're specifically so the radiation protection technologists, the health physicists, basically everybody that's working on those engineering adjacent jobs.
And there's SWE, the
Yeah.
Society of Women Engineers.
Yeah.
And there are also societies for professional administrative assistants, professional secretaries. So there has been a movement of making connections with other women and through professional organizations, which we all need to support each other. And there's been the Old Boys Club for many, many years. Well, women are now building up that support systems among themselves as well.
These are wonderful. Thank you, ladies. I have one question for either of you or both. What do you see for the future of women working at Hanford?
Yeah, so future of Hanford, because I mean, I'm an elder millennial, so as far as like what I see at Hanford is more women in more positions of authority, where we're helping call the shots, we're helping with moving environmental stewardship forward and keeping things on track as far as the cleanup is concerned, and basically being stewards of our community as far as helping undo the damage that was done during the Manhattan Project and the Cold War years. Because as much as the history is rich as far as the legacies of Hanford is concerned, as far as the stories to tell, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that the work that was done for the greater good of humanity to basically save us from communism and fascism. It it did a doozy on the environment, but it's kind of one of those things where basically seeing more women in STEM, seeing more women in those positions of authority, and basically helping see the mission through to the end.
Well, and I'm seeing a difference in attitude. So as I look at it over the decades, what I see in the earlier years is women showing up, going to work, learning hard things, and then quietly changing things. But also as a woman of a certain age, um, a lot of times I see the older women pushing against the barriers that were very real and there. I see younger women, as I mentioned earlier, being much more confident, understanding that they have a place at the table. They don't need to make their place at the table. They're going to come to the table, they're going to give their ideas, they're going to be act and be treated as a professional, understanding there are still some undercurrents. We're a long ways from being totally gender neutral when it comes to, are you an engineer? Are you a custodian? Are you whatever? But I see a tremendous difference, particularly in the confidence and the stepping up and saying, this is who I am. It's not even really questioned that you shouldn't be here. And that I see in the attitude of the women. Now, I'm not so sure, there are lingering issues, but I'm just so impressed with this upcoming generations.
It's really awesome to hear. And that kind of makes me question, are your intentions with this research to kind of keep it historical, or do you have intentions of interviewing this kind of like new wave of female Hanford workers and trying to do like story comparisons to see how it's changed their personal experiences?
So basically with the series, because originally Terry and I did The Hanford Girl, which was purely World War II. And it was so well received that people were like, "Oh, what about the Cold War?" And that's when it was like, okay, right, enough people have asked, there's enough interest to basically get this off the ground to where we started working on The Hanford Woman, which covers 1947 to 1991. And there were some, like even just from World War II to the Cold War, there were some differences between what women were able to do. I mean, case in point, Sally Slate's story from the 1950s, where she had to quit when she got to a certain point in her pregnancy, in comparison to Laurie Mitchell's from the 1980s, where she was able to stay on the job, but in a modified assignment to where she wasn't working in the danger zones. And she was able to keep working. And I think for me, it would be interesting to kind of basically kind of like start exploring the 1990s into the 2000s, because that's 20 years right there of history to where it's like, okay, it would be interesting to see has anything changed since the fall of the Iron Curtain, and kind of take it from there. But
Yeah. At
that's
this point
just,
in time, both Megan and I have a very full plate, and we keep getting these tantalizing ideas and these things that we would love to do, but at this point in time, we don't have anything planned. But every time we do this presentation, people tell us some of their amazing stories, and we look at each other like, oh, somebody needs to be documenting this. And we are living in another period of history.
yeah, we are.
And unfortunately, at this point in both of our careers and our lives, we're not able to pursue it right now, but it's not off the table.
Yeah,
It might just be postponed for a while.
yeah. It's a when the dustiness settles and we have a free minute or five.
So not only more research is needed, but more researchers are needed.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is again
Absolutely.
why I want people to talk to their families. Don't wait for someone to gather these stories and present them. Find out from your families, your neighbors. It's it can create a lot more understanding too, and in terms of if you understand where somebody has come from, that maybe generationally will get along a little bit better.
All right. So we did have another question come in through the chat, and I think this one's kind of interesting. In your research, did you uncover anything about the FBI's secret search for lesbians working for the Manhattan Project during the Cold War, including at Hanford? They were labeled the Manhattan Eight, and there was the Seattle Times story, maybe that came out in about 2023. Anything about that?
That is
We did
definitely something
not.
that we didn't uncover, but so a little bit more about me. I'm actually in college to get my degree in history so I can be a professor, and like that directly would tie in as far as like any sort of like FBI activity during that time period. That would actually tie into the Lavender Scare, which was actually adjacent to the second Red Scare during the McCarthy time period for in the Senate. And that was basically anybody that was different. So basically anybody that was LGBTQ was considered un-American. And it was just this very, very large witch hunt because of the geopolitical climate at the time, because of the Cold War, because we were afraid of the communists, because 1949 rolls around, we're not the only ones with a nuclear weapon. The Soviets detonated their own atomic weapon in Kazakhstan, and it was a carbon copy of the Fat Man bomb, which meant they cheated off of our homework. And it's just a lot of this like the distrust that we had for the communists during World War II was set aside because of the old Arabic proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And after the Nazis basically kind of did the Soviets dirty with all their non-aggression agreements and everything, that's when the Soviets joined the Allies. And that's just a whole big old rabbit hole. But long and the short of it, that wasn't something that we necessarily looked into when we were developing this presentation, but it is something that definitely does deserve to be addressed.
Another one of those more research is necessary. That's an important thing to research. I'm not so sure that it'll be very difficult to find answers on that. A lot is still classified. I was in Washington, D.C. I went to the Library of Congress and I tried to pull files from World War II and the early Cold War. And much of what I was looking for is not available yet to the public. So I would imagine that kind of surveillance might be very difficult to find.
Yeah. And a lot of documentation has been lost to history, and there have been stories of documents unfortunately being mixed in with waste that got burned. So it's definitely like basically a needle in a haystack when it comes to finding information that is available, that is verifiable, that is useful for creating presentations like this. The oral histories that we've collected and that we have access to through the Hanford History Project have been absolutely indispensable because these are the stories of people that lived it. And this is how we're able to preserve history is by listening to these stories and collecting these stories because once the people that are telling them are gone and they're not recorded, that's it. So listening to the stories of the women in your life that lived during this time period is so, so important.
Well, that gives me another question. Um, and this is for either of you. What was probably like the most impactful story or tidbit that you guys heard in all of your interviewing?
Mhm. Um, Probably for me, listening to Wanda Munn. She has we I talked with her quite a bit, but she also has some extensive interviews on the Hanford History Project where she gets very real about her experiences, about how, and she had to make her place at the table, and yet seeing how she reaches out to others, how she worked across gender, um, and across all the different organizations, and how she worked all the way up onto on presidential commission levels, and yet she would take time to affirm people who weren't anywhere near her level. I was just so impressed with her.
I think for me, being able to like hear Liz Kerfman's story was absolutely impactful because up until the top program, by and large, Hanford was not a place where people of color were in these positions in the labs. Because during World War II, people of color were relegated to the lowest of the tasks. I mean, men of color fared better than women, by and large, if you look at it through a specific lens. Men of color were able to keep the jobs that they had outside of Hanford, specifically in construction, working on like concrete finishing. But women that came to Hanford, they were maids, they were cooks, they were housekeepers, they were picking up after people, like literally picking up dishes that were being held above people's heads and run back to the kitchen as quickly as they possibly could. And the top program was there to put women and minorities into these positions that were otherwise not accessible. And Liz Kerfman's story about being one of the first women of color working at Hanford in this capacity in the analytical laboratories, where she's riding the bus to work and people are looking at her like she's some sort of exotic creature because they've never seen a woman of color before. And then with the fact that segregation and having like people of color having to sit at the back of the bus and people just like looking at her like, well, why aren't you back there? And it's it was just very impactful being able to like have the privilege of hearing her story because it paints that picture of how tumultuous the 1960s were and how there was a lot of ground that was broken because of the Civil Rights Act in a lot of ways.
I want to tag on to that I highly recommend the book that Robert Franklin and Robert Bauman wrote called Echoes of Exclusion. I didn't realize that Kennewick was a sundowner town. If you were a person of color, you had to be out of town before the sun went down. And this went right up until the civil rights movement. So there were a lot of challenges, and particularly for the women of color, but for anyone of color, it was a challenging time. And to hear these stories being retold and to see the graciousness in which we're being allowed a window into that world was amazing, was absolutely amazing.
We have another question, if you're up for it. For women who married other Hanford workers, was there a large divide between what they could do and how they would spend time together outside of work?
So people marrying each other at Hanford did not cause issues like we saw with the woman that was head of household in her home that married a man that did not work on site. So they, of course, were still able to still live in Richland. And it honestly became more of a, are they working the same shift or are they working opposite shifts? And that was basically the very cut and dry of it was that was an issue of like, oh, who's working? Is somebody working a night shift? Is somebody working a day shift? Is somebody working swing shift? Because Hanford was around the clock mission. And there was also the understanding that work stayed at work, where Elaine was actually telling us about this, where they didn't talk about work at home, where work stayed at work. And this was because of national security, specific clearances, because a few of the women that we interviewed had Q clearances, which were those top secret clearances where they were privy to information regarding things that were of a sensitive nature for national security. And a lot of that, what is said here stays here mentality from World War II was carried over throughout the Cold War. And that's how it was navigated was work stayed at work and they figured out as far as logistics went, workplace stuff when it came to working shifts. And it wasn't necessarily even a question of, oh, who's taking the car, because there was still a bus system that would you could take to and from work without any trouble.
I'm going to ask our attendees if they have any questions. This is the time to put them on the chat or unmute if you would like to ask your question. We want to be mindful of Megan and Terry's time. And again, thank them for their wonderful presentation today. Sarah, is there anything else that you have for our presenters tonight?
No, just, I mean, I could ask more questions. Absolutely. So I do have one. Did you, I guess it's kind of like about your presentation in general. So why have you decided to call it the Hanford Woman versus the Hanford Women?
So that was kind of more of that evolution from the Hanford Girl because of how women were referred to during the Manhattan Project, because women were always referred to as girls. And it was kind of more of that nod to how the feminist movement like helped with getting away from that and just that acknowledgement of these were women and not girls. And we did actually receive some feedback from people about the name of the Hanford Girl presentation and having to explain it. So that's just how women were referred to. And
And that goes back to the documents that were given to the women of World War II. The women secretaries were given a manual that's the title of the manual was the Hanford Girl. And at the end, it kind of praises you that if you follow all of these rules, you will be an efficient Hanford Girl. So we wanted to move that into the Hanford Woman, but keeping it singular rather than plural brings the emphasis down to these are individuals. These are all individuals with strengths and who brought their best to this whole project. So rather than just looking at them globally, we want to look at the individuals, but see the societal overlay on the individual itself, themselves.
I have another question. If women had to leave their jobs at 5 months pregnant, were they able to come back or apply for a different job? Or was pregnancy the end of it?
It depended on a lot on what time frame we're looking in. Most of the time, women will end up just staying home because we don't have a lot of the support services. We don't have daycare, and even right up until well, even up until now, I moved here from 3,000 miles away. I didn't have a support system. People who came in for World War II, they vast majority of them came from somewhere else. You don't have aunts and grandmas and people
no
who
village,
can
there was no
provide daycare
village.
for you. So very often once you started having children, you stayed home until your children were at least in school and maybe even longer. But most of that was just practical necessity. There's not the support systems. There were some daycare, very, very little,
Yeah.
even throughout the Cold War era.
Yeah, because in the case of one of the women that we interviewed, she got pregnant and she was able to stay at her job because she was well removed from any of the dangers out on site, but her maternity leave was very short-lived. I mean, basically go have her baby and then being back to work less than 6 weeks later,
Mhm.
just purely just out of that necessity of going back to work because there was no paid maternity leave. There was none of these safety nets that are in place today that hold our spots at work. And a thing like things as far as coming back to work after having a baby, things have improved since the Cold War, but there still is unfortunately a lot to be desired as far as supports go for a lot of people. And typically, it's like the farther away you get from now into basically looking backwards at the Cold War, pregnancy was that, oh, off with the shoes and back into the kitchen with you. And then if they were able to revisit going back to work, it wasn't until the kids were more self-sufficient and were able to get themselves to school under their own steam.
So I think I have a follow-up to that for for specifically mothers who were whether they were coming back to work at Hanford or just coming to work at Hanford for the first time, were they treated like vastly differently by maybe like the single women or the other men out there, like just for being a mother?
It was not my experience that anybody that we actually talked to addressed that at all. As far as other women were concerned, we're all in the same boat. So,
Yeah, I mean, some of the women that we interviewed did say that dealing with the men was a lot more pleasant than dealing with the women because there was a certain level of pettiness. But by and large, especially in the analytical labs, the everybody that worked on the same crew, they were a family and they got to know each other really, really well. They would have basically a pre-shift meal together or a post-shift meal together, and that was your core group because you spent more time with your coworkers on your shift than you did with your family in the long run because of the shift work environment at Hanford. And it was just one of those things where everybody had a job to do and everybody was part of the mission, which during the Cold War was national security and in some aspects also environmental stewardship, because by the time the mid 1970s rolled around, there's only one reactor at Hanford running, and that's N. And all of the other reactors are shut down. And we're starting to kind of get into that exploration of decon and demo and just starting to work towards cleanup, which wasn't the top main priority until the fall of the Iron Curtain.
Do we have any final questions? I think there's one more. If you are up for it. I have the question, are there similar experiences in women working at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to these described by you?
Yeah, because the Pacific Northwest National Lab came in the 60s. So a lot of what we said throughout the 60s would be very, very similar experiences there. Megan, do you have an opinion on that?
So, like Terry said, the national lab became a national lab in in the mid 1960s. 1965 is when Battelle took over that contract. And with that time period and women working at the national lab, it's very it's not a stretch to surmise that women at the national lab at that in that time period navigated the same issues that women out on site did.
Okay. Well, we would like to thank everyone for attending tonight's event, asking questions, and watching. This event was recorded and it will be up shortly on both our Ecology Facebook pages and the Ecology YouTube channel. There is a reminder that we will be adding this recording link to our website for everybody to watch after the fact if you didn't have a chance to attend tonight's presentation. And with that, I want to ask my co-host tonight if you have any questions or thoughts, my dear Sarah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just really want to thank, our presenters, Megan and Terry, for giving your time tonight and sharing your expertise of this information. I found it completely fascinating. I feel like I could ask questions all night long about it. So if you guys ever think about doing another series, I'm so here for it. And just, thank you for helping bring these stories to light and celebrating International Women's Day and Women's History Month with us. And then I also want to thank you, Anna Griselle, for your continued facilitation of this Let's Talk About Hanford series. It's fantastic, and I think it's a really great thing that you're doing. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was a pleasure, as always, co-hosting this event with you. I want to give final thanks to our wonderful presenters. Like Sarah said, we would love to do future projects with you. The attendees are also thanking you for having this wonderful conversation with us tonight. And yeah, just thank you. And if you have any final thoughts, Terry or Megan?
We also want to thank you for giving us this opportunity and just, and
Yeah.
again, I'm sitting here going, we have so many more things that we need to look into. This
Oh,
is part of the reason why we like doing these things. We hear stories, we get ideas, and it sends us off on rabbit trails and things that are important to know. So we want to thank you. We want to thank the audience who asked questions, and we definitely want to encourage you to go out to the Hanford History site. The Bioreactor Museum Association has programs. It's a second Monday of every month down at the Richland Public Library. They're free. They will be taking a break over the summer from having public programmings, but over the summer, you can also find that there's going to be tours of the Hanford Site that are sponsored by the Department of Energy out of the Logston National Park headquarters. And the National Park is going to be sponsoring talks called Atomic Explorations. And that will be in the Logston Center. It will be 6 days a week and a variety of topics where volunteers for the national park will be talking. My specialty is going to be on the alphabet people, people who lived in the alphabet houses during World War II. So you can find that on the National Park website probably in about another month. And Megan just recently gave a program at the Bioreactor Museum Association. I don't know if you're going to get a chance to give that one again publicly, but it was awesome.
Well, so if anybody asks me nicely, I will be more than happy to do another round because during my spring break from CBC, I'm going to be out on site for the Women in Engineering group, telling them about Dr. Chiang-Sheng Wu and how she helped to save the B reactor from failing in 1944.
That's really awesome. Well, thank you again, both of you. These important conversations need to be present. And with this, we finish tonight's event. Thanks one more time, and we would love to have you again for a future event.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank
Okay.
you.